Wealthy developer loses everything when he falls desperately for the activist fighting him. The council chamber buzzed with the electric tension of a community at war. Every seat was filled, voices rising in heated argument, signs waving like battle flags. At the center of it all stood Sheila Murad, her dark eyes blazing as she gripped the podium. Ross Development wants to erase our history, she declared, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. They want to bulldoze the homes where 3 generations of families have built their lives, replace them with luxury condos that none of us can afford. From the back of the room, Nolan Ross watched her with an intensity that made his chest tight. He'd seen her photograph in the newspaper, read about her activism, but nothing had prepared him for the raw power she commanded. Every gesture was deliberate, every word a precision strike aimed directly at his empire. They call it progress, Sheila continued, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. But progress for whom? Certainly not for Mrs. Patterson, who's lived on Maple Street for 40 years and now faces eviction. Not for the Martinez family, who built their small business from nothing and now watch their dreams crumble. Nolan's hands clenched involuntarily. She was destroying everything he'd worked for, dismantling his reputation with surgical precision, and yet he couldn't look away. The passion in her voice, the fire in her stance, it stirred something in him he thought he'd buried years ago. Their eyes met across the hostile crowd. Time stopped. She faltered mid-sentence, her breath catching as steel-gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her pulse race. For a heartbeat that lasted an eternity, the room faded away. There was only this, the electric recognition sparking between them, the impossible attraction that defied everything they were supposed to be. "We won't let them win," she finished, her voice slightly unsteady now, though she never broke eye contact with the man who represented everything she was fighting against. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause, but Nolan remained motionless, studying her with the focus of a man seeing something that would change his life forever. What happens when the very person you're meant to destroy becomes the one you can't stop thinking about? If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our Diary of Love. Chapter 1. The morning sun cast long shadows across Nolan's penthouse office as he stood before floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city wake up below. His reflection stared back, expensive shirt, perfectly knotted tie, the armor of success that had taken him 20 years to build. But his calloused hands, wrapped around a coffee mug, told the real story of where he'd come from. "You're distracted," Vincent Clooney observed from the leather chair across the room. His legal advisor's voice carried the measured concern of a man who'd watched Nolan rise from his father's failed contracting business to this empire. Last night's council meeting didn't go as planned. Nolan turned from the window. The community's more organized than we anticipated. It's not the community, it's her. Vincent opened a file on his lap. Sheila Murad, former social worker, now full-time troublemaker. She's got them eating out of her hand. The name hit Nolan like a physical blow, though he kept his expression neutral. He could still see those dark eyes blazing with conviction, still hear the slight tremor in her voice when their gazes had locked. She's smart, Nolan said simply. She's dangerous. Vincent leaned forward. This project is worth 40 million, Nolan. Your biggest yet. You can't let one activist with a God complex derail everything you've built. Nolan walked to his desk, his movements controlled despite the restlessness clawing at him. The development plans were spread across the mahogany surface. Clean lines, modern aesthetics, everything designed to transform a struggling neighborhood into something profitable. Something his father would have called a miracle. What do you recommend? Cut off her funding. Most community organizations survive on grants and donations. Make a few calls. Apply some pressure? No. The word came out harder than Nolan intended. Vincent's eyebrows rose. No. We win this the right way. Better design, better community outreach, better presentation. Vincent studied him with the eyes of a man who'd seen too many clients make emotional decisions. Since when do you care about community outreach? Since last night. Since those eyes met his, and something inside him shifted like tectonic plates. Since he'd lain awake replaying every word she'd spoken, every gesture, every moment, when her professional mask had slipped to reveal something vulnerable underneath. I care about winning, Nolan said instead. 20 minutes across town, Sheila sat in the cramped back office of the Riverside Community Center, surrounded by protest signs and stacks of legal documents. The coffee was terrible. The heating barely worked, and her desk was a second-hand metal monstrosity that belonged in a government office from 1975. But this place was home in a way her apartment never quite managed to be. You were magnificent last night, Diane Baker said from the doorway. The 60-year-old community matriarch carried 2 steaming mugs, her silver hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for decades. Had them on their feet before you finished. Sheila accepted the coffee gratefully. We bought ourselves time, nothing more. Ross Development has resources we can't match. Maybe, but they don't have heart. Diane settled into the folding chair across from Sheila's desk. Speaking of heart, when's the last time you thought about your own? Diane. I'm serious, child. You're 42 years old, beautiful, brilliant, and you spend every waking moment fighting other people's battles. When do you fight for yourself? Sheila stared into her coffee, seeing steel gray eyes that had watched her from across that council chamber. The intensity in his gaze had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She'd prepared for everything last night. Hostile crowds, aggressive questions, even threats. She hadn't prepared for the way her heart had stuttered when Nolan Ross looked at her. The community needs you healthy and whole, Diane interrupted, not burning yourself out for everyone else's happiness while your own life passes you by. Sheila's throat tightened. 5 years ago, she'd thought she had it all. A career as a social worker, a relationship with a man who claimed to understand her passion for justice. Then Marcus had gotten the promotion that required relocating, and suddenly her dreams became negotiable. Her community work became a hobby he tolerated. Her fire became something that embarrassed him at dinner parties. The choice had been simple in the end. He'd chosen his career. She'd chosen her principles. Neither had chosen love. I tried that once, Sheila said quietly. It didn't end well. Marcus was a fool who wanted to dim your light, not celebrate it. Diane reached across the desk to touch her hand. That doesn't mean you give up on finding someone who sees your fire and wants to burn alongside you. The image that flashed through Sheila's mind was unwelcome and dangerous. Expensive suits and eyes that seemed to see straight through her defenses. She pushed it away ruthlessly. Right now, I need to focus on stopping Ross' development. Diane studied her with the knowing look of a woman who'd raised 6 children and guided half the neighborhood through various crises. Just remember, baby girl, sometimes the thing we're fighting hardest against might be exactly what we need. An hour later, Nolan stood at the construction site where his father had once struggled to build homes for young families. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was now wealthy enough to buy and tear down entire neighborhoods, while Thomas Ross had died barely scraping by, his contracting business always one missed payment away from bankruptcy. This is where it started, he murmured to himself, running calloused hands over the blueprints. Despite the expensive clothes and penthouse office, his hands told the truth. He'd worked construction summers through college, learning every aspect of the business his father had nearly destroyed through poor decisions and misplaced trust. Never again. That had been his promise to himself at 18, watching creditors circle like vultures. Never be vulnerable. Never show weakness. Never let anyone close enough to destroy what you've built. The philosophy had served him well. His developments were legendary for quality and attention to detail. His business relationships were professional and profitable. His personal life was carefully compartmentalized. Ex-wife Coretta had been beautiful, sophisticated, and perfectly content with the emotional distance he maintained. Until last night, when a community organizer with fire in her eyes had looked at him and something inside his chest had cracked open. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Coffee shop on 5th and Main. 3 p.m. We need to talk. Esmeralda Nolan stared at the screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. She wanted to meet alone, away from the crowds and cameras and public battle lines they'd drawn. This was either the best idea he'd ever heard or the most dangerous. He texted back, "I'll be there." Share in the comments. Have you ever felt drawn to someone you knew you should stay away from? What did you do? The coffee shop was neutral territory, too public for real intimacy, too casual for business. Sheila arrived first, choosing a corner table where she could watch the door. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around her mug, a reaction that annoyed her. She'd faced down city councils, corporate lawyers, and hostile developers without flinching. One man shouldn't be able to unnerve her so completely. But Nolan Ross wasn't just any man. He walked through the door at exactly 3 o'clock, and Sheila's breath caught. Without the formal setting of the council chamber, he looked less like a corporate predator and more like what he truly was, a man who'd built an empire with his own hands. The expensive suit couldn't hide the way he moved, confident but not arrogant, aware of his surroundings in a way that spoke of years spent on construction sites. Their eyes met across the crowded cafe, and that same electric recognition from the night before hit her like lightning. He approached her table with measured steps, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Murad." She gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Mr. Ross, thank you for coming." He sat, and suddenly the small table felt intimate. She could smell his cologne, something expensive but not overwhelming, and see the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into the sun. Up close, he was even more dangerous to her equilibrium. "You wanted to talk," he said. "Director, no small talk or social pleasantries." She appreciated that, even as it made her pulse race. "I wanted to understand you." The words came out more honestly than she'd intended. Your father built homes for working families. You want to tear down a neighborhood full of working families? What changed? Something flickered in those steel gray eyes. Pain, maybe. Or recognition that she'd done her homework. My father built homes he couldn't afford for people who couldn't pay. For them, Nolan said quietly. It nearly destroyed our family. He died believing he was a failure. And you're determined not to make his mistakes. I'm determined not to make any mistakes. Sheila leaned forward slightly, drawn despite herself by the glimpse of vulnerability beneath his controlled exterior. What if caring isn't a mistake? What if sometimes the right choice isn't the profitable one? Their faces were inches apart now. She could see gold flecks in his gray eyes, could count the individual lines that spoke of years carrying weight alone. What if you're wrong? He asked, his voice rougher now. What if caring is exactly the mistake that destroys everything you've built? The question hung between them, heavy with meaning that had nothing to do with real estate development. Sheila's heart hammered as she realized they weren't really talking about construction projects anymore. Then maybe what you built wasn't worth keeping, she whispered. For a moment, the world narrowed to this table, this conversation, this impossible attraction crackling between them like a live wire. Nolan's hand shifted on the table, his fingers almost touching hers. Almost. Then reality crashed back. A camera flashed from across the cafe. Someone had recognized them, was taking pictures of the developer and the activist having what looked like an intimate conversation. They jerked apart, the spell broken by the reminder of who they were supposed to be. This was a mistake, Sheila said, already pushing back from the table. Probably, Nolan agreed. But his eyes never left her face. She stood, grabbing her purse with shaking hands. Stay away from my community, Mr. Ross. I can't do that, he said simply. The words stopped her at the door. She looked back, seeing something in his expression that made her chest tight with longing and terror in equal measure. Why not? Because you're part of it now. Sheila fled the cafe, her heart racing and her strong walls shaking with every step. Behind her, Nolan sat alone at the small table, staring at the space where her hand had almost touched his, and wondering what the hell he was going to do about falling in love with the one woman who could destroy everything he'd worked for. Chapter 2. The photograph appeared in the morning paper with the headline, Unlikely Allies. Sheila stared at it over her coffee, seeing herself and Nolan leaning toward each other across that cafe table, their faces intense with conversation. To anyone watching, they looked like lovers sharing secrets. Her phone rang before she could process the implications. Have you lost your mind? Jazz's voice crackled through the speaker. At 26, Jasmine Hull had all the righteous fury of youth combined with sharp intelligence that made her Sheila's most effective protege. The whole community's talking about this picture. Sheila closed the paper. It was a strategic meeting. Know your enemy kind of thing. By gazing into his eyes, like he's your soulmate. The accusation hit too close to home. Mrs. Patterson called me crying. She thinks you're selling us out. Half the neighborhood's ready to find a new leader. The words landed like physical blows. These people had trusted her with their dreams, their futures. The idea that they might doubt her commitment felt like betrayal from both sides. I would never... I know that, but perception matters. You taught me that. Jazz's voice softened. Just be careful, Sheila. Men like Ross don't change. They just get better at hiding who they are. Across town, Nolan faced his own reckoning. Anthony Burke stood in the penthouse office like a storm cloud, his silver hair immaculate despite the early hour. As Nolan's primary business partner, Burke had invested heavily in the Riverside project. His patience for complications was non-existent. "Explain this." Burke slapped the newspaper onto Nolan's desk. Nolan glanced at the photograph without flinching. "Community outreach. I'm trying to understand their position. By having romantic coffee dates with their leader." "It wasn't romantic." Burke's laugh was harsh. "Tell that to my investors. They're already nervous about the delays, and now they think you're compromising the project for a piece of—" "Finish that sentence and we're done." Nolan's voice dropped to a dangerous level that made Burke step back. "She's getting to you. I can see it." Burke's tone shifted to something almost paternal. "I've known you 15 years, Nolan. You don't make emotional decisions. That's what's made us both rich. Don't start now." After Burke left, Nolan stood at his window, staring down at the streets below. Everything he'd built was predicated on emotional distance and making decisions based on profit margins rather than human cost. It was a philosophy that had served him well, made him wealthy beyond his father's wildest dreams. So why did it feel like a prison now? His phone buzzed. Emergency at the Riverside Community Center. Mrs. Patterson collapsed during the morning protest. Nolan was in his car before he consciously decided to go. St. Mary's Hospital emergency room buzzed with controlled chaos. Sheila sat in a hard plastic chair, still wearing the Save Our Neighborhood t-shirt she'd thrown on when Diane called about Mrs. Patterson's heart attack. The 73-year-old woman had been protesting outside the development office when she'd clutched her chest and collapsed. "Family?" the nurse asked. "She doesn't have any," Sheila replied. "I'm the closest thing." The nurse's expression softened. "The doctor will be out soon with an update." Sheila nodded, her hands twisted in her lap. Mrs. Patterson had lived on Maple Street since 1951, had raised 4 children in the same house, had buried her husband in the backyard garden he'd loved. If Nolan's development went through, all of that history would be erased. "How is she?" The deep voice made Sheila look up sharply. Nolan stood in the doorway, his expensive suit incongruous among the worried families and hospital staff. He held a coffee cup in each hand. "What are you doing here?" "I heard what happened." He offered her one of the cups. "Thought you might need this." Sheila stared at the coffee, then at his face. There was genuine concern in those gray eyes. "If you're here to gloat, I'm here because an elderly woman is fighting for her life, and that's more important than business." He sat in the chair beside her, close enough that she could smell his cologne again. "How long has she been in there?" 3 hours. Sheila's voice cracked slightly. "They won't tell me anything because I'm not family." "What's her full name?" "Patricia Marie Patterson." "Why?" Nolan pulled out his phone, made a call. "Vincent? I need you to call St. Mary's Hospital. Patricia Patterson admitted today. Tell them she's covered under the Ross Development Medical Fund." "Yes, I know we don't have one." "We do now." Sheila watched him in shock. "You can't just—" "I can do whatever I want with my money." He ended the call, his eyes meeting hers. "She'll get the best care available." "Why?" The simple question hung between them. Nolan was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "My father had his first heart attack at 58. We couldn't afford the specialist he needed, couldn't afford the surgery that might have saved him. He died because caring about people was a luxury we couldn't afford. He looked at her then, and the pain in his eyes was raw and unguarded. Maybe I'm tired of repeating his mistakes. The admission hit Sheila like a physical blow. This was the vulnerability she'd sensed, the wound that had shaped everything he'd become. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his hand. The contact was electric. Nolan's fingers turned under hers, their palms touching for just a moment before both pulled away as if burned. Mr. Ross? A doctor appeared, clipboard in hand. Mrs. Patterson is asking for you both. They followed the doctor down sterile corridors that smelled of disinfectant and fear. Mrs. Patterson looked small in the hospital bed, with oxygen tubes in her nose, but her eyes were alert. Child, she said to Sheila, come here. Sheila moved to the bedside, taking the older woman's frail hand. How are you feeling? Like I got kicked by a mule. Mrs. Patterson's voice was weak. But I'll live to fight another day. Her gaze shifted to Nolan, who stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed. You must be the developer. Yes, ma'am. You paying for this fancy room? It's nothing. Mrs. Patterson studied him with the eyes of a woman who'd raised 4 children and buried 1 husband. My grandmother used to say you can tell a man's character by how he treats people who can't do nothing for him. Nolan shifted uncomfortably. I'm just trying to do the right thing. Maybe. Or maybe you're trying to buy forgiveness for what you plan to do to our neighborhood. Her tone wasn't accusatory, just matter of fact. Which is it? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sheila found herself holding her breath, waiting for his answer. I don't know, Nolan said, finally. Maybe both. Mrs. Patterson nodded, as if his honesty satisfied her more than any pretty lie. At least you're not pretending otherwise. That's something. Later, in the hospital cafeteria, Sheila and Nolan sat across from each other at a small table. They'd been there for 6 hours, taking turns checking on Mrs. Patterson, and somewhere in that endless afternoon, the walls between them began to crumble. Tell me about your father, Sheila said. Nolan's hands wrapped around his coffee cup. His calloused fingers spoke of years doing manual labor. Thomas Ross was a dreamer. He wanted to build homes that working families could afford. And he wanted to prove that you could be successful without screwing people over. Sounds like a good man. He was. But good doesn't pay the bills. His contracts always went over budget because he refused to cut corners. He'd spend his own money making sure families got quality work, even when they couldn't afford to pay him what he was worth. Sheila heard the love in his voice, but also the frustration. You think kindness killed him? I think kindness made him vulnerable, and that gets you destroyed in this business. Is that what you learned? That caring is dangerous? Nolan was quiet for a long moment. When he looked at her, something had shifted in his expression. My father died believing he was a failure because he measured success by the wrong things. Kindness doesn't put food on the table or keep the lights on. Maybe. But what's the point of keeping the lights on if you're living in darkness? The words seemed to hit him physically. His jaw tightened. Pretty philosophy. But I've seen what happens when people lead with their hearts instead of their heads. Have you? Sheila leaned forward. Or have you just been so afraid of your father's mistakes that you've never tried to do things differently? Different how? Let emotions cloud my judgment. Make decisions based on what feels good instead of what makes sense. Make decisions based on what's right instead of what's profitable. They stared at each other across the table, the challenge hanging between them like a gauntlet. Finally, Nolan stood, ending the conversation. Mrs. Patterson will be fine. The doctor said she can go home tomorrow. Nolan, wait. This doesn't change anything, Sheila. I'm still building that development, and you're still going to fight me. She stood too, facing him. Then why did you come here today? Because despite everything my head tells me, I couldn't stay away. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. And for a moment, neither moved. Then Nolan turned and walked away, leaving Sheila standing alone among the empty tables, her heart racing and her world tilted completely off its axis. 3 days later, Sheila stood in her bathroom, facing the mirror, preparing for another community meeting. The reflection staring back at her looked tired, conflicted. Ever since the hospital, she hadn't been able to stop thinking about the pain in Nolan's eyes when he talked about his father, the way his voice had roughened when he admitted he couldn't stay away from her. "You're falling for him," she said to her reflection. The admission terrified her. Marcus had taught her that love was a luxury she couldn't afford, that passion was something that got in the way of real goals. But with Nolan, the attraction wasn't just physical. It was recognition, a soul calling to soul despite everything that should keep them apart. Her phone rang, Diane's number. "Turn on Channel 7, Diane said without preamble. Sheila grabbed the remote, flipping to the local news. Esther Rivera stood outside the Ross Development office, microphone in hand. Sources close to the Riverside Development project report tension between developer Nolan Ross and his business partner, Anthony Burke, over community relations, Esther was saying. Some suggest Ross may be reconsidering aspects of the controversial project. The camera cut to footage of Nolan leaving the hospital 3 days ago, his expression grim. Then to Burke outside his office, obviously angry. "Mr. Ross remains committed to this project," Burke told the reporter. "Any suggestion otherwise is pure speculation." But his tone suggested the opposite. Sheila could see the cracks forming in Nolan's empire, the pressure building from all sides. She was destroying his life just by existing and making him question everything he'd built. "This is bad," she murmured. "Or it's exactly what needed to happen," Diane said. "Sometimes people need their worlds shaken up to remember who they are." That evening, the community center was packed for the weekly strategy meeting. Jazz stood at the front, reviewing their legal options, while Diane organized volunteers for the next phase of protests. Sheila tried to focus, but her mind kept wandering to his steel gray eyes and the way Nolan's voice had cracked when he'd talked about his father. "Sheila?" Jazz was looking at her expectantly. "The zoning board hearing is on Tuesday. Are you ready?" "Of course." Sheila forced her attention back to the room. "We'll present the historical preservation argument first, then the economic impact study." "Good. And if Ross shows up?" "We treat him like any other developer trying to destroy our neighborhood." The words sounded hollow, even to her ears. Jazz's expression suggested she wasn't fooled. "Right. Just remember, we can't afford to look weak. Not now." After the meeting ended and the last volunteers had gone, Sheila sat alone in the empty community center. The protest signs leaned against the walls like tired soldiers, and the boxes of legal documents seemed to mock her with their weight. She'd built her entire adult life around this, being the voice for people who had no other advocate. So why did it feel like she was losing herself in the process? The soft knock on the door made her look up. Through the glass, she could see a tall figure silhouetted against the streetlights. Nolan. She opened the door, and he stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the small space. He looked different, tired, his usually perfect shirt wrinkled, his hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it. "We need to stop meeting like this," she said, trying for lightness. "Do we?" His voice was rough, strained. "Because I've been trying to stay away from you for 3 days, and it's driving me insane." The raw honesty in his voice made her breath catch. "Nolan, I can't sleep. I can't focus. Burke's threatening to pull funding. My investors think I've lost my mind, and all I can think about is you." He stepped closer, and she could see the torment in his eyes. This was costing him everything, just like it was costing her. "This is impossible," she whispered. "I know. We're on different sides of everything. I know. If people knew how I felt about you, I'd lose all credibility. My community would never trust me again." "How do you feel about me?" The question stopped her cold. They stared at each other in the dim light of the community center, surrounded by the evidence of everything that should keep them apart. "I think you know," she said finally. Nolan moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Tell me anyway." "I think about you all the time. I replay every conversation, every look, every moment when we almost touched." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "I dream about you, and I wake up feeling guilty because I should hate everything you represent." "But you don't. Number, I don't." They were inches apart now, his gray eyes dark with the same longing that was tearing her apart. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could count every line around his eyes. "This will destroy everything," she breathed. "I know. We should be smart. We should stay away from each other." "Probably." "Then why aren't we?" Instead of answering, Nolan reached out and traced her cheek with one calloused finger. The touch was gentle, reverent, and it sent fire racing through her veins. "Because sometimes the thing you fight hardest against is exactly what you need," he said, echoing Diane's words from days ago. Sheila's eyes fluttered closed at his touch. When she opened them, she saw something in his face that made her heart stop. Not just desire or tenderness, but recognition. The look of a man who'd found something he hadn't known he was searching for. "We can't," she whispered, even as she leaned into his touch. "Then tell me to leave." The words hung between them, like a lifeline and a trap. All she had to do was say it, and he would walk away. They could go back to being enemies, to the safety of their separate worlds. She could go back to fighting him without the complication of wanting him with every fiber of her being. "Tell me to leave, Sheila." She opened her mouth to say the words. Instead, what came out was, "I can't." The admission broke something open between them. Nolan's other hand came up to frame her face, his thumbs brushing over her cheekbones with infinite gentleness. "Neither can I." For a heartbeat, they stood frozen on the precipice. Then the world exploded in light as camera flashes went off outside the windows. Footsteps, voices, the sounds of reporters who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. They jumped apart, the spell shattered by the harsh reality of their situation. Through the glass, Sheila could see Esther Rivera organizing her camera crew, other reporters following her lead. They followed me, Nolan said, his voice tight with self-recrimination. Of course they did. Sheila's hands shook as she ran them through her hair. This is exactly what they've been waiting for. More flashes, more voices. By morning, the pictures would be everywhere. The community organizer and the developer, caught in an intimate moment that would destroy both their credibilities. I have to go, Sheila said, grabbing her purse. Sheila, wait. No. She turned to face him one last time. This was a mistake. It has to be. She pushed past him toward the back door, but his voice stopped her. It didn't feel like a mistake. She looked back, seeing the same longing in his eyes. That's what makes it so dangerous. Then she was gone, leaving Nolan alone with the protest signs and the sound of reporters calling her name in the distance. Chapter 3. The photographs were everywhere by morning. Sheila stared at her laptop screen, scrolling through news sites that all carried variations of the same headline. Developer and activist, secret romance. The images were damning. Nolan's hands framing her face, her eyes closed in surrender, both of them looking like lovers sharing an intimate moment. Her phone had been ringing nonstop since dawn. You need to see this, Jazz said, bursting into the community center office without knocking. She carried a stack of printed emails, her young face tight with anger. Half the neighborhood is calling for your resignation. Sheila's stomach dropped as she read the messages. Words like betrayal and sellout jumped from the pages. Mrs. Patterson, despite her recent heart attack, had written, I defended you to my neighbors. How could you make me look like a fool? They think I'm compromised, Sheila said quietly. Are you? The question hit like a slap. Sheila looked up to see Jazz's dark eyes blazing with disappointment. I looked up to you. You taught me that principles matter more than personal desires, that we fight for what's right, not what feels good. Jazz's voice cracked. Was it all lies? Number everything I've taught you, everything I believe. It's all true. Then what the hell were you doing with him? Sheila stared at the photographs on her laptop screen. What had she been doing? Falling in love with a man who represented everything she'd spent her adult life fighting against. Losing herself in his gray eyes that seemed to see straight through her defenses. I don't know, she admitted. Jazz's expression softened slightly. Sheila, I've watched you sacrifice everything for this community. Your personal life, your relationships, your happiness. Please don't throw it all away for some rich developer who'll get bored and move on to the next conquest. After Jazz left, Sheila sat alone with the weight of 20 years of community trust pressing down on her shoulders. Every person she'd helped find housing, every family she'd kept from eviction, every victory they'd won together, all of it was at risk because she'd been stupid enough to let her guard down with the enemy. Her phone rang. Diane's number. How bad is it? Sheila asked without preamble. Bad, but not unfixable. Diane's voice was calm, practical. Emergency community meeting tonight. Gives you a chance to explain yourself. What if I can't? What if no explanation makes sense? Then you tell the truth and let them decide if they still trust you. The truth is that I'm falling in love with a man who wants to destroy everything we've built. Diane was quiet for a long moment. And what's his truth? The question caught Sheila off guard. What do you mean? I mean, is he still the same man who wants to destroy us, or has he changed too? Across town, Nolan faced his own crisis. Burke stood in the penthouse office like an avenging angel. The morning newspapers spread across the mahogany desk. $40 million, Burke said, his voice deadly quiet. That's what this project is worth. That's what you're gambling with for some activist who's been leading protests against us. Nolan didn't look at the papers. He'd seen the photographs, had stared at them for hours trying to figure out how something that felt so right could look so damaging in black and white. The project will move forward. Not like this. My investors are already getting cold feet. They think you've been compromised, that your judgment is clouded by. Burke's lip curled. Whatever this is, my judgment is fine. Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're ready to throw away everything we've built for a woman who's made her career out of opposing men like us. Nolan turned from the window to face his partner. Men like us? Successful, powerful, white. Burke's tone was matter-of-fact, as if these were simply business considerations. She's using you, Nolan. Can't you see that? She gets the big bad developer to fall for her, makes him look weak, and suddenly her community sees her as the woman who brought down the enemy from the inside. The words hit like physical blows, each one designed to find the vulnerable spots in Nolan's armor. Because wasn't that exactly what he'd been afraid of? That caring would make him vulnerable. That opening his heart would give someone the power to destroy everything he'd worked for? Get out, Nolan said quietly. What? Get out of my office. Now. Burke's face flushed red. You're making a mistake that will cost us millions. Then maybe it's time we reconsidered our partnership. After Burke left, slamming the door behind him, Nolan sank into his chair and buried his head in his hands. Everything was falling apart. His business relationships, his reputation, the empire he'd spent years building. All because he'd looked into dark eyes blazing with passion and seen something that made his world seem hollow. His phone buzzed. Vincent's number. Burke called me, his lawyer said without preamble. He wants to force you out, claiming that you're mentally unstable. Can he do that? He owns 30% of the company, and he's got the ear of every major investor. If he can prove you're making decisions based on emotion rather than business sense. Vincent trailed off. Nolan, what the hell is going on? Nolan stared at the photographs on his desk. In them, he looked like a man surrendering to something he'd fought his whole life. Vulnerability, connection, the dangerous possibility of love. I think I'm losing my mind, he said finally. Over an activist who's been fighting you every step of the way? Over a woman who makes me remember why my father thought kindness was more important than profit. Vincent was quiet for a long moment. Your father died broke, Nolan. Yeah, but he died knowing who he was. Can I say the same? That evening, storm clouds gathered over the city like a bad omen. By 6 o'clock, rain was lashing the windows of the community center, and thunder rolled across the sky in waves. Despite the weather, the meeting room was packed, every seat filled with neighbors who'd come to hear Sheila explain herself. She stood at the front, looking out at faces she'd known for years. Some angry, some disappointed, some simply confused. These were people who trusted her with their dreams, their futures. People who deserved better than a leader whose judgment had been compromised by inappropriate feelings for the enemy. I won't insult you with excuses, she began. The photographs you've seen are real. I met privately with Nolan Ross, and things became personal. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Someone called out, "How could you?" Sheila raised her hand for silence. I could tell you it was strategy, that I was trying to manipulate him for information. But that would be a lie, and this community deserves the truth. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. The truth is that somewhere in the process of fighting him, I began to see him as more than just a developer. I saw a man who grew up working class and built his success from nothing. A man who paid for Mrs. Patterson's medical care without being asked, and a man who's beginning to question whether profit should be the only measure of his success. So you're defending him now? The voice belonged to Tom Martinez, whose family business was directly in the path of the development. I'm defending the possibility that people can change, that enemies can become allies if we give them the chance. Or lovers? Jazz's voice cut through the crowd like a blade. Sheila met her protege's eyes across the room. I won't lie to you. My feelings for him are complicated, but that doesn't change my commitment to this community. How can we trust you when your judgment is compromised? Mrs. Patterson's voice was weak but clear. How do we know you won't sell us out for a man who's already got everything he wants? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Before Sheila could answer, the lights flickered and went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting eerie shadows across the room. Outside, the storm was intensifying, wind howling like a living thing. Everyone stay calm, Diane called out. Looks like we're going to be here for a while. But as people began to settle in to wait out the storm, Sheila noticed someone was missing. Jazz's seat was empty. The young woman must have slipped out during the commotion, probably disgusted by everything she'd heard. Sheila's heart broke a little more. Jazz had been like a daughter to her, the embodiment of everything she'd hoped to accomplish through her activism. Losing her trust felt like losing a piece of herself. I need some air, Sheila announced, grabbing her jacket. You can't go out in this weather, Diane protested. But Sheila was already heading for the door, desperate to escape the disappointed stares of the community. The rain hit her heavily, soaking through her jacket in seconds. She ran toward her car, her feet slipping on the wet pavement. Then she saw him. Nolan stood beside a black sedan, his suit plastered to his body, his hair streaming with water. He looked like he'd been waiting there for hours. What are you doing here? She shouted over the wind. I came to talk to your people, to explain. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face. To tell them this isn't your fault. Go home, Nolan. You've done enough damage. Have I? He stepped closer, rain streaming down his face. Or have I finally done something right? Before she could answer, a tree branch crashed down across the street, sparks flying from a downed power line. The storm was getting worse, turning the neighborhood into a dangerous maze of flooding and debris. We can't drive in this, Nolan said, grabbing her arm. Where's the closest safe place? Sheila looked around, her mind racing. The community center was full of people who'd lost faith in her. Her apartment was 6 blocks away, through streets that were rapidly becoming impassable. There, she said, pointing to a small building across the parking lot. The old daycare center. It's been closed for renovation, but it's structurally sound. They ran together through the storm, their feet splashing through puddles that were quickly becoming small streams. Nolan's hand was warm and solid on her arm, guiding her through the chaos. When they reached the building, he used his shoulder to force the door open. Inside, it was dry but dark, emergency lighting casting weird shadows across empty rooms. They stood dripping in the entryway, suddenly aware that they were alone together for the first time since that moment in the community center when the cameras had caught them. "Does your phone have service?" Nolan asked, wringing water from his shirt. Sheila checked. "No signal. Yours?" "Same." He looked around the space. "Looks like we're stuck here until the storm passes." The words hung between them, loaded with possibility and danger. They were trapped together, away from the cameras and crowds and expectations that had been pulling them apart. Just two people who'd been fighting an impossible attraction, suddenly given the time and privacy to stop running from what they both knew was inevitable. "I should call off the project," Nolan said suddenly. Sheila looked at him in shock. "What?" "The Riverside development. I should withdraw the proposal, find somewhere else to build." He ran his hands through his wet hair. "Burke's right. I've lost all objectivity. I can't make rational decisions when it comes to you. So, your solution is to give up everything you've worked for? My solution is to stop hurting you." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. "You think that would stop the hurt?" Nolan stepped closer, his gray eyes intense in the dim light. "Wouldn't it? Isn't that what you want? For me to disappear so you can go back to your community without this complication?" "What I want?" Sheila laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I want to stop dreaming about you and waking up feeling guilty. I want to stop wondering what it would be like if we weren't on opposite sides of everything. And if we weren't?" The question was soft, dangerous. They were close enough now that she could see water droplets on his eyelashes, could feel the heat radiating from his body despite their wet clothes. If we weren't what? On opposite sides. If there was no development, no community fight, no cameras or business partners or protesters. If we were just us. Sheila's heart hammered against her ribs. There is no just us, Nolan. There's too much history, too much at stake. What if there wasn't? What if I told you I've been trying to figure out how to be the man you could love instead of the enemy you have to fight? His thumb traced the line of her cheek with infinite gentleness. The touch set her skin on fire, made her lean into his palm despite every rational thought screaming at her to pull away. "I can't," she whispered. "Can't what?" "Can't love you. Can't let myself want this." Her eyes fluttered closed. "Can't keep pretending I don't." When she opened her eyes, she saw something in his face that made her breath catch. Not just desire, but reverence. Wonder. The look of a man who'd found something precious and was afraid it might disappear. Then, don't pretend. The kiss was inevitable. It had been building since that first moment their eyes met across the council chamber. His lips were warm and soft, tasting faintly of rain and coffee and something uniquely him. When her arms went around his neck, when she pressed herself against the solid wall of his chest, it felt like coming home and falling off a cliff at the same time. They broke apart, both breathing hard, foreheads touching as they tried to process what had just happened. His hands slid into her hair, tilting her face up so he could look into her eyes. "I'm in love with you, Sheila. I've been fighting it for weeks, telling myself it was just attraction, just the challenge of someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. But it's not. It's love." The confession hung between them, changing the very air they breathed. Sheila felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I love you too," she whispered. This time when he kissed her, it was different, deeper, more desperate, filled with longing. Her hands fisted in his wet shirt, pulling him closer, needing to feel every inch of him against her. When his mouth moved to her neck, when she felt his teeth graze the sensitive skin below her ear, she made a sound that was part gasp, part moan. "We shouldn't," she breathed, even as she arched against him. "Probably not." His voice was rough with desire. "Tell me to stop." Instead, she pulled his head down and kissed him again, pouring all her confusion and longing and desperate love into the kiss. When they finally broke apart, both were shaking. They found themselves in what had once been the daycare's quiet room, lit only by the emergency lighting and the occasional flash of lightning through the windows. Nolan's jacket became a blanket on the carpeted floor, his hands gentle as he traced the lines of her face in the dim light. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. In answer, she reached up and began unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers trembling slightly, but her resolve steady. This might be the only moment they'd have. She wanted to memorize everything. The feel of his skin under her hands, the way his breath caught when she touched him, the reverent way he whispered her name. What happened between them was tender and desperate, passionate and gentle, full of whispered confessions and gasping promises. They came together like two people who'd been searching their whole lives for exactly this: a perfect fit, a perfect moment, and an understanding that transcended all the reasons they should stay apart. Afterward, they lay entwined on the makeshift bed, her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat and the storm raging outside. The real world felt very far away. "What happens now?" Sheila asked softly. Nolan's arms tightened around her. "I don't know. But I know I can't go back to pretending I don't love you. Even if it costs you everything?" "Especially then." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "My whole life, I've been afraid of being vulnerable, of caring more than the other person. But with you, I'd risk everything rather than live without this." Sheila closed her eyes, memorizing the feeling of being held by him, of being loved completely despite all the obstacles between them. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, which meant their stolen moment was almost over. "They'll crucify us when this gets out," she said. "Probably. Your business partner will destroy you." Probably. "My community will never trust me again." Nolan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "What if we gave them a reason to—" "What do you mean?" He shifted so he could look down at her, his gray eyes serious. "What if I proved that falling in love with you didn't compromise my judgment? It improved it. What if instead of building luxury condos, I built affordable housing, mixed income development that preserves the neighborhood character while providing the economic growth everyone needs?" Sheila stared at him. "You'd do that?" "I'd do anything to be worthy of what I feel for you." Before she could respond, they heard voices outside, search teams calling their names, flashlights cutting through the storm-dimmed windows. Their stolen moment was over. As they dressed quickly, both aware that stepping outside meant returning to a world that would judge them harshly, Nolan caught her hand. "Whatever happens next, this was real. What we feel for each other is real." Sheila squeezed his fingers. "I know, but real doesn't always mean possible." "Then let's make it possible." The words were a promise and a challenge. As they prepared to face the cameras and questions and disappointed faces waiting outside, both knew their lives would be irrevocably changed. The question now was whether their love would be enough to overcome everything trying to tear them apart. Have you ever had to choose between following your heart and doing what others expected of you? Tell us about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more love stories that defies all odds. Chapter 4. The photographs from the storm aftermath were even more damaging than the first set. Nolan and Sheila emerging from the abandoned daycare center, their clothes disheveled, their faces glowing with unmistakable intimacy. The headlines screamed variations of "Caught in the Storm of Love" and "Developer's Secret Affair Exposed." By morning, Nolan's office was in chaos. Burke had called an emergency board meeting for 10 o'clock, and Vincent was fielding calls from reporters and investors with the grim efficiency of a man handling a crisis. Burke's got signatures from 60% of the investors, Vincent reported, his voice tight. They want you removed as CEO. Claim you're making decisions based on personal relationships rather than business sense. Nolan stood at his window, watching the city wake up below. Somewhere out there, Sheila was facing her own reckoning, probably fighting for her credibility with a community that had already been questioning her judgment. What if they're right? Nolan said quietly. What? What if I am making decisions based on personal relationships? He turned from the window. What if that's not a weakness, but the first smart thing I've done in 20 years? Vincent stared at him. Nolan, they can destroy you. Take everything you've built. And what exactly have I built, Vincent? An empire based on profit margins and emotional distance? A life so carefully controlled that I never risk feeling anything real? Before Vincent could answer, Nolan's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Community meeting tonight, 7 p.m. Come alone. Nolan stared at the message. Sheila was asking him to walk into the lion's den, to face the very people he'd been trying to displace. It was professional suicide. He typed back, I'll be there. The board meeting was exactly what Nolan expected. A tribunal designed to strip him of everything he'd worked for. Burke sat at the head of the conference table like a judge, flanked by investors whose faces showed varying degrees of disappointment and disgust. The Ross Development Group has always prided itself on professional excellence, Burke began. We make decisions based on sound business principles, not personal whims. Get to the point, Anthony, Nolan said. The point is that your judgment has been compromised by an inappropriate relationship with an activist who opposes our projects. Your behavior has become erratic and your decisions questionable. The board has lost confidence in your leadership. Richard Pemberton, one of their biggest investors, leaned forward. Is it true you've been having an affair with this Murad woman? Nolan met his gaze steadily. My relationship with Sheila Murad is personal and private. Not when it affects our investment, another investor snapped. We've put $40 million into the Riverside project. If you've been compromised, I haven't been compromised. I've been enlightened. The room went silent. Burke's face flushed red. Enlightened? Burke asked, seething. Nolan stood, moving to the presentation screen at the front of the room. For 20 years, I've built developments that maximize profit while minimizing community impact. I've been so focused on avoiding my father's mistakes that I forgot his dreams. He pulled up the original Riverside plans, sleek luxury condos with no regard for the existing neighborhood character. This project would have displaced 300 families to house 60 wealthy ones. It would have erased history to create profit. He switched to a new set of plans he'd been working on through the night. This is what I'm proposing instead. The new designs showed a mixed-income development that preserve the neighborhood's character while providing modern amenities. Community spaces, affordable housing units, and commercial space for local businesses were integrated seamlessly with market rate homes. You'll make half the profit, Burke said, his voice tight with anger. I'll make something better. I'll make a legacy worth leaving. This is insanity, Pemberton said. You're throwing away millions for some activist who's brainwashed you. No, Nolan said quietly. I'm finally remembering who I wanted to be before fear turned me into who I thought I had to become. The vote was swift and decisive. By noon, Nolan Ross was no longer CEO of the company he'd built from his father's ashes. But as he cleaned out his office, he felt lighter than he had in years. Across town, Sheila faced her moment of truth. The community center was packed again, but the mood was different this time. Expectant rather than angry, as if people were waiting to see what she would do with the trust she'd betrayed. Jazz stood near the back, her young face neutral. Mrs. Patterson sat in the front row, her recent hospital stay evident in her pallor, but her eyes as sharp as ever. Diane presided over the gathering with the calm authority of someone who'd seen everything and been surprised by nothing. I won't ask for forgiveness, Sheila began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. What I did was selfish and stupid and potentially devastating to everything we've worked for. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but she held up a hand for silence. But I will ask you to judge me by what happens next, not by what happened in that storm. What does happen next? Tom Martinez called out. Ross Development still wants to bulldoze our neighborhood. Actually, they don't. The voice from the back of the room made everyone turn. Nolan stood in the doorway, his expensive suit replaced with jeans and a simple button-down shirt. He looked different, without the corporate armor. Younger, more approachable, more like the working-class kid he'd once been. The room erupted in angry voices, but Diane's sharp whistle cut through the noise. Let the man speak, she said. Nolan moved to the front of the room, his eyes finding Sheila's across the hostile crowd. The look that passed between them was electric, full of love and support. My name is Nolan Ross, and until this morning, I was CEO of Ross Development Group. I'm here because the woman you're angry with just saved your neighborhood. Saved it how? Someone called out. By teaching me that some things are more important than profits. He moved to the easel at the front of the room, pulling out the same revised plans he'd shown to the board. This is what I'm proposing instead of luxury condos. Mixed income housing that preserves your community character while providing economic opportunities. Affordable units for families like yours. Market rate homes for young professionals. And commercial space for local businesses. The room went quiet as people studied the plans. Mrs. Patterson stood slowly, leaning on her cane as she made her way to the front. You're telling us you're willing to make less money to do right by us? I'm telling you, I'd rather make less money and sleep at night than make millions and lose my soul. Mrs. Patterson studied him with those sharp eyes, then looked at Sheila. And this has nothing to do with you being sweet on our girl here? It has everything to do with her, Nolan admitted. Maybe it's time to change the system. Pretty words, Jazz said from the back, her voice skeptical. But how do we know you mean them? How do we know this isn't just some elaborate scheme to get what you want? Nolan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a legal document. Because I'm putting it in writing. a binding commitment that 70% of the housing units will be affordable to families making less than 80% of the area median income. Community oversight of all construction decisions, and a guarantee that any family displaced during construction gets first right of return at their current rent. The room erupted in discussion. People leaned over to examine the plans, pointing and arguing and slowly beginning to see the possibilities. "There's one more thing," Nolan said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I can't do this alone. The city will fight me. Other developers will call me crazy. And I'll need someone who knows this community inside and out to make sure I don't screw it up." He looked directly at Sheila. "I need a partner, someone who cares about the community and who's not afraid to call me out when I'm wrong." The job offer hung in the air like a lifeline, but Sheila knew it was more than that. It was a chance to transform everything: the neighborhood, their relationship, their futures. "What about your business?" she asked. "Gone. Burke and the investors voted me out this morning." Nolan smiled, and for the first time since she'd known him, it reached his eyes. "Turns out loving you was the best business decision I ever made." Mrs. Patterson thumped her cane on the floor. "Well, I'll be damned. The man's got spine after all." "So what do you say?" Diane asked, looking around the room. "Do we give him a chance to prove himself?" The vote wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive. By a margin of 3-1, the Riverside community decided to work with Nolan Ross on a development that would preserve their neighborhood while providing the economic growth everyone needed. As the meeting broke up, people clustered around the plans, asking questions and making suggestions. Jazz approached Sheila hesitantly. "I owe you an apology," the young woman said. "I thought you were betraying us, but maybe you were saving us." Sheila hugged her protege tightly. "You were right to question me. That's what I trained you to do. Never stop holding your leaders accountable, even when you love them." 7 months later, the groundbreaking ceremony for the new Riverside community development drew hundreds of people. Local politicians rubbed shoulders with longtime residents, while reporters documented the unusual partnership between a former developer and the activist who'd once been his greatest opponent. Nolan stood at the podium, wearing work boots and jeans. The transformation was more than cosmetic. He'd spent the past months learning every aspect of community development, working with local organizations and resident councils to design something that truly served the people who lived there. "This project represents more than new housing," he said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "It represents the idea that business success and community welfare don't have to be mutually exclusive." He looked out at the faces watching him: Mrs. Patterson in the front row, beaming with pride; Jazz and Diane standing with other community leaders; Vincent, who'd quit his corporate job to become Nolan's partner in the new venture; and Sheila, standing off to the side, her dark eyes glowing with love and pride. She wore a simple sundress that emphasized her curves, her natural hair framing her face in the morning sunlight. The ring on her left hand caught the light, a simple diamond band they'd chosen together. "None of this would have been possible without the woman who taught me that the best victories are the ones where everyone wins," Nolan continued. "My partner in business and in life, Sheila Murad Ross." She joined him at the podium, her presence transforming his nervous energy into confident strength. They broke ground together, their hands wrapped around the same shovel, their wedding rings glinting in the sunlight. Around them, The community they'd both learned to love cheered and applauded, celebrating not just a construction project, but the triumph of love over fear, connection over division. That evening, they sat on the porch of the house they'd bought together in the heart of the Riverside neighborhood. It wasn't the penthouse Nolan had once called home, or the tiny apartment where Sheila had lived alone for years. It was something better, a place that reflected both their histories and their shared future. Nolan turned to look at Sheila, his gray eyes soft with the kind of love that had once terrified him and now anchored his entire world, and kissed her as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. What barriers have you overcome for love? Please share your story, and don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss these stories of hearts that found their way to each other against all odds. Like this video if it moved you, and share your own story of love that conquered obstacles in the comments below. Tomorrow, we have another incredible tale of unexpected passion waiting for you.